bridges, the harmful dead, and a fiery phallus. It's time for more Roman festivals, this time in the months of May and June, on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome. My name's Neil, and in this episode I'm continuing the mini-series about festivals in ancient Rome by looking at the months of May and June. If you've been listening to the mini-series, you would have heard me speak about the poet Ovid and his poem The Fasti, which covered the months and the festivals within them. You may also have heard me mention that this wasn't completed, and June was the last month we have. I'm going to miss Ovid when I cover the next months. Though he wasn't an historian, his insights and thoughts on the festivals were both interesting and very useful. If only he hadn't done whatever he did or didn't do, which resulted in his exile by Augustus. As ever, you can find me on X, Blue Sky, Instagram and TikTok as Ancient Blogger, which is also the name of my YouTube channel. And of course, there's ancientblogger.com, where you can find all sorts of ancient history content, including notes for this episode, which include a transcription, reading list, and anything else I think might help. The Ancient History Hound subreddit is still growing and recently clocked 4,500 members, which is amazing. So thank you if you've joined. Finally, reviews. If you can rate or review, please do, as this makes the podcast more visible. Though I should say a big thank you to all listeners, whether you're new or you've been listening for a while. So thanks again to everyone who has taken the time to listen. Okay, let's get to it. If you've been listening to the previous episodes on the festivals of each month, you'll know what's up first, the name of the month. So what was May named after? The answer is a big no idea. Macrobius, who lived in the early 5th century AD, noted several options though. These included the name of the month being after a deity from nearby Tusculum, who was called Maius, the wife of Vulcan, the mother of Mercury, and the goddess of the earth. He also wrote an option which Ovid, writing centuries earlier, included, that the month took its name from the word for elders, maiores. It wasn't just Ovid. Varro, another source who lived in the 1st century BC, had this same idea and how it came about. So it went that Romulus had selected the elders of early Rome and given them prestige. This month honoured them. It also linked to the naming of the next month, which I'll mention later. With that said, it seems here we meet a returning theme, namely those in Rome speculating but not knowing exactly. One final piece of trivia. Both Ovid and Plutarch refer to May being a bad time to marry. Ovid made a fleeting comment, but Plutarch speculates on a number of reasons, including that the elder origin of the month's name, apparently marriage was for the young and therefore not appropriate for a month honouring the more senior. It's certainly an interesting take. Our first festival, called the Lemuria, took place on May the 9th, and very little is known about it. It consisted of a single ritual performed to ward off malign forces, spirits or ghosts. A festival, though, for the dead wasn't new. If you'd listened to February's episode, you might recall the Parentalia. This also included the deceased, but it was different in a number of ways. The Parentalia was aimed at appeasing deceased family members and the wider ancestors. They're also, generally speaking, not hostile. Another major difference was the social nature of it all. The Parentalia was for people to mix and even try to outdo each other. The Lemuria was in stark contrast and took place at midnight, with the head of the household walking barefoot whilst making a sign with his thumb and closed fingers. This was to ward off any harmful spirits. Next, he'd throw some black beans behind him, and whilst doing so, he'd say, "With these beans I throw, I redeem me and mine." This was spoken 9 times, and he would refrain from turning round. Next, he'd touch some water and make a sound using bronze. He'd then finish by saying, "Ancestral spirit depart," 9 times. The ritual now finished, he could turn round and presumably go back to bed. Now I said that the Parentalia was very different, but there was that ritual that I spoke about which looked to silence critics of the family in it. At the parentalia, it was performed by an old woman and included two elements found here: beans and a spell or chant being uttered. In fact, the beans were in the mouth of the old woman while she uttered that chant. A question you might have is, why was there a need for the Lemuria, and how did it overlap with the parentalia? Well, in the case of the parentalia, this was very different in terms of what it aimed to do. It was about placating and honouring the ancestral dead. The Lemuria was more about the hostile dead, which could include family members, or at least seems to have, but also the non-family and those strangers, and just generally any malign forces. The hostile dead were a widely accepted dynamic outside of Rome. I've recorded a couple of episodes on the types of harmful ghosts, shades or spirits which were found in Mesopotamian and Greek culture as part of my annual Night of the Living Dead Halloween specials. What the Lemuria might have done is tap into this wider cultural practice. With that said, the Lemuria was given a distinctly Roman origin story by Ovid, perhaps to distinguish it and help explain and justify it within the Roman framework of beliefs. Ovid's account began with a much-peeved Remus, or rather, the much-peeved ghost of Remus. We might remember Ovid's version of the famous death of Remus in the previous episode, which wasn't committed by his brother, but by a chap called Sella. This version of the myth continues with Remus bemoaning his fate and absolving his brother of any involvement to his very surprised foster parents. He asks them to find a way to celebrate him, and so the pair go to Romulus, who agrees, and so begins a festival which will remember and honour Remus. The name of the festival is the Remuria, and Ovid explains that the change in name to Lemuria was due to the passage of time. He also explained the overlap between the parentalia and the Remuria, or Lemuria. This links back to a time where Rome apparently only had 10 months in the year, with the year starting in March and ending in December. That gap in time had yet to be allocated to the months of January and February. Now, of course, this is debated, and it's something I discuss in the January episode. As the parentalia occurred in February, it hadn't yet been established. In short, Ovid positions the Lemuria as the original festival for the dead, with the parentalia added later when February was introduced. One final point on the Lemuria is the name. The transition from Remuria to Lemuria seems a bit stretched. It takes its name from the word lemures, which is a rare word. Its earliest appearance we have comes from Horace in the 1st century BC, where it seems to indicate an unpleasant spirit. Perhaps the original use of the word had been lost by the time of Ovid, and so we have Remuria, which allows it to be linked to Rome's mythology. It's all tied up in a way, just not very neatly. Moving on then, what we need to do is lighten the mood. And what better way than a religious event involving a likely instance of substitute human sacrifice? Well, this is Rome after all. Around the 14th of May was the Argei. This was a procession led by the Flaminica Dialis and included the Vestal Virgins, who carried with them straw bundles shaped like men. The procession had travelled through Rome and ended at the Pons Sublicius, Rome's oldest bridge. The Vestals then threw the straw dolls into the river Tiber, whilst the crowds watched. It's tricky to know where to start with this one, as there's a lot going on. To start with, let's consider the main religious component of the procession, the Flaminica Dialis. She was the priestess of Jupiter, and married to the Flamen Dialis, the priest of Jupiter. This was a prestigious position, and one which came with a number of restrictions. Amongst other things, the Flamen couldn't ride a horse, touch a she-goat or ivy, and even beans. He couldn't spend 3 nights away from his bed, be naked outdoors, or be outside without his cap. He also couldn't touch any bread fermented with yeast. As mentioned, there were other restrictions, and all of these seem to have extended to his wife, the Flaminica, who also had some extra requirements. She had to have a twig in her hair from a fruitful tree, wear a dyed robe, and couldn't go up more than 3 rungs on a ladder. At the Argei, the Flaminica was specifically required to appear as if in mourning, with her hair unkept. The Vestal Virgins are probably more familiar. There were 6 of them, and they were involved in most public religious ceremonies. Here they threw those straw bundles into the Tiber. The number of these is disputed, with 27 mentioned by Varro and 30 by Dionysius of Halicarnassus. What the sources all seem to broadly agree upon, though, is that these represented humans. That is to say, they were a substitute for what had once been people. If you listen to the 2 episodes I did on human sacrifice in the ancient world, you might be familiar with how this practice manifested in a number of cultures, including both Greece and Rome. There are a couple of infamous instances of it in Greek myth: the sacrifice of Iphigenia, which allowed the Greeks to sail to Troy; the inclusion in Homer's Iliad of Achilles sacrificing Trojan prisoners at the funeral for Patroclus. After the sack of Troy, the ghost of Achilles appeared and demanded the life of Polyxena in order that the Greeks can leave. The first of these 3 examples is a good example of substitute sacrifice. In later myths, or later versions of the myth, Iphigenia is spared at the last moment, with Artemis saving her and replacing the girl with a deer. Here, the straw dolls replace humans, but why? Well, it's not clear, and the later sources do their best to try and explain it all by linking it to events which predate Rome. Central to this is Hercules, which might seem odd, but there are several myths about Hercules travelling through what would become Rome. In fact, the altar to Hercules in the Forum Boarium, and the cult there, has been argued as existing as far back as the 6th century BC. He was far more influential at Rome than you might have thought. Dionysius of Halicarnassus wrote that Hercules came across the practice when passing through, and persuaded the locals to move from people to straw dolls. Festus recounted how it had been old men thrown into the Tiber, and Episadius, a freedman of Sulla, is cited in Macrobius as stating that Hercules had thrown in the Tiber dolls representing those companions he'd lost on his journey. Ovid's take is slightly different. Some of Hercules' men from Arcadia had decided to stay in the area near the Tiber, and one developed a longing to return home. His wish was for his body to be thrown in the Tiber when he died, with the idea that it would return home. However, doing this wouldn't follow the correct funerary rites, and so he was buried, and a representation of him, in the form of a straw doll, was thrown in the Tiber. The association with Greeks is furthered through the word itself. Arge is thought to relate to Greeks, with another suggestion being that it was Greeks who'd been the initial victims of this ritual. Crucial to the ritual was the Tiber, and the involvement of this river might provide a different angle on it all. The Tiber was a boundary of sorts, and there was a type of ritual which we know of from ancient Greece which involved boundaries and people. The scapegoat ritual is generally known from its appearance in the Old Testament. A pair of goats were used in this rite, one being loaded with the sins and impurities and driven into the wilderness, with the other being sacrificed. In ancient Greece, the word pharmakos was often used to designate a person who would undertake a similar role. This manifested in a variety of ways, from the pharmakos being symbolically beaten and driven across the boundaries of a settlement, to the more extreme, where a pharmakos was killed or severely injured as part of the ritual. It's plausible that the original ritual involved someone being cast into the Tiber as a symbolic act, or even something more permanent, with the death of a person or persons being a required part of it. As with other festivals I have spoken about, there is likely an older practice, which both the modern academic and the likes of Ovid were left scratching their heads about. It's another good example that people in ancient Rome were looking into their past and trying to work it out as much as, say, we are in the modern day. Earlier I mentioned the idea of one suggestion as to how May got its name from, when Romulus named it after the elders or maiores. The act of division also created the juniors, and this is one reason why June got its name. Like May, however, there were other candidates. June named after Juno is sometimes offered, but there was also the name borrowed from Junonius, a name used elsewhere for this month. Just to keep a score, we are 6 months in, and so far we only have the naming conventions of January and March as confidently agreed upon. These were named after the gods Janus and Mars. February is a close one, but in that instance it's more thematic, as it seems to be linked to purification in a general sense, not something necessarily specific, though again you can go and listen to the February episode and I get into it in a bit more detail there. The main festival for June, which I'm going to discuss, is the Vestalia, which took place between the 7th and 15th of June. This was for the goddess Vesta, and was conducted by the Vestal Virgins. I'll start with the goddess it was all about, and indeed who the Vestal Virgins were all about, or for. Vesta might not be a deity you immediately think of when it comes to the Roman pantheon, but she was crucial to Roman worship. Cicero, in his work on the nature of the gods, gives a nice overview of her, and I quote, "The name Vesta comes from the Greeks, for she is the goddess whom they call Hestia. Her power extends over altars and hearths, and therefore all prayers and all sacrifices end with this goddess, because she is the guardian of the innermost things." End quote. Vesta was everywhere and involved in the basics of worship for all other deities through the flame at an altar. Cicero notes her as linked to the Greek goddess Hestia. Here too is a goddess you don't hear much about, but was also very important. Of those deities born to Kronos and Rhea, which included Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon and Zeus, she was both the oldest and the youngest. This feat was achieved through her being born first, but also being regurgitated last by her father after he had swallowed both her and her siblings. In Greece she was likewise held in high esteem. The public hearth in towns and cities was sacred to her. There were a lot of sacrificial feasts in ancient Greece, and her sacred flame at the altar made it all possible. Her worship at Rome was said to be founded by Numa, Rome's second king, who established the Vestal Virgins to oversee her worship, and this took place in a building which was unusual for a number of reasons. To begin with, this wasn't a Roman religious building as you might expect. No grand rectangular temple, but a small circular building in which her flame was kept burning. There was no statue to her. The flame was her representation, and tending this was a key duty for the Vestals. You've noticed, possibly, that I've not called her building a temple, and that's because it's debated whether it was ever a temple. The building was known as the Hades Vestae, and in order to understand more about it, I asked an expert on the Vestal Virgins. You may know Dr. Peter Greenfield from the podcast The Partial Historians, and she fielded this question as well as expanding on a few points. So take it away, Dr. G.
So, the Hades Vestae. Why isn't it a temple? It's a really good question. And there are a few things that we do need to keep in mind. First of all, there's a general consensus that a templum was a structure built on ground that was consecrated by augurs. Now, augurs are a very specific type of priest, and the whole process of consecration was designed to redefine a space, a piece of ground, so that it was appropriate as a site where religious rituals could be performed. That's all well and good. That's what we mean when we talk about a templum. There is a structure built on consecrated ground. And then we have this term Hades, and in particular when we're thinking about the Hades Vestae, which is this beautiful circular structure, and it's not called a templum. So what is going on with this? So we have to separate these two terms out a little bit, because Hades is a designation also for a religious structure, which may or may not be a templum. We've got two different terms. They're very different sounding, very differently in spelling. We have to assume that there's some nuance of meaning here that maybe we're not fully across. If you look up Hades in the Latin dictionary, it will say see templum. So we've got some things to work out here. So there's a general assumption that the Hades Vestae predates the development of the augur's role in consecrating ground. And further to that the Hades Vestae was initially part of the regal complex, together with the structure known as the Regia, this sort of trapezoidal building that's right on the edge of the Forum and the Via Sacra. So the Hades and the Regia are unusual buildings, very close together, and they're both thought to be quite old and date back as far as the regal period. So the whole situation becomes more murky, though, because then we have the regal period to deal with, which is vastly full of stories, none of which were written down for a very long time. And the first king of Rome, Romulus, is sometimes described as a rex augur. So he was somebody who was both the king and somebody who was able to read the auspices. So he had both the ability to see the signs and interpret the signs of the gods, and he also had the legal authority to make judgments about what the next step should be. And so then you're like, okay, but if Romulus was the Rex and he was also the augur, surely he would have had the capacity to consecrate the ground on which the Aedes Vesta was built, in which case, isn't it a templum? And it is possible that the ground that the Aedes Vestae was built on was consecrated in some way, but we just don't know exactly how and the whys and the wherefores. We're dealing with a period of time in Rome's history where we don't have good written records, and it is a cult of long antiquity, and the style of the structure being circular in nature means that perhaps it was just understood to be different in some kind of way by the Romans than a templum, for reasons that we're still not entirely clear about. Further to this, there are some suggestions in our source material, and these come to us quite late in the Christian tradition, so really we're open to a lot of questions here. But the idea that Vesta was not just a goddess associated with fire, but a goddess associated with the earth itself. Further to that she had chthonic associations, that her powers dipped down between the planes between the above world and the below world, and she had connections with the dead. And that connection would stretch through the nature of the earth. And this, too, might explain why the building is an Aedes rather than a templum, because the ground that the structure stood on may have had to be treated from a ritual and religious perspective as a special case. The Aedes Vesta also is not the only Aedes in Rome. There are other structures that go by this title. And I think there is a real gap in the research where we could explore all of the examples of Aedes to try and figure out what are the interconnections between them all. So the Aedes Vesta is unique in some really particular ways, but it is also food for thought about the complexities of language when it comes to thinking about what makes something a temple and what makes it something else that's also religiously and ritually significant. These are questions I find absolutely fascinating.
Thanks to Dr. G for a fab explanation. I've mentioned the Partial Historians podcast a few times and even been a guest on it. It's a must listen, so go check them out, and also their book, Your Cheeky Guide to the Roman Empire. As mentioned, the worship of Vesta was facilitated by the Vestal Virgins. It's thought that there were originally 4, but by the imperial period they were 6 in number. The selection process to become a Vestal was restricted to the elite families, where girls between the ages of 6 and 10 could be chosen. This was rigorous. Both parents had to be alive, and the prospective Vestal was inspected for any physical blemishes. And this even extended to her ability to speak clearly. If successful, a Vestal was expected to serve for 30 years. Vestals were involved in a number of religious activities, for example, carrying those straw dolls in the Age. They also made mola salsa, a mixture of salt and grain, which was used to make salted cakes, or used generally in religious ceremonies. However, as mentioned, tending the flame was their main responsibility, and they were accountable for it if it went out. Indeed, the high status of the Vestals and their importance could result in the ultimate price being paid. If a Vestal was convicted of losing her chastity, she could be entombed alive. There was another type of accountability that they were subject to. As the Vestals came from the elite families, they might be targeted by politicians who were rivals with their families. In terms of what went on during the Vestalia, well, we don't have much information. The festival seems to have opened with an opening of a section of the Aedes Vestae, which was normally closed throughout the year. This wasn't open to the public, though. It merely permitted the Vestals and the Pontifex Maximus to go in there. A second act closed the festival, or seems to have occurred at the end, and this involved sweepings and anything cleaned from the building being thrown into the Tiber. It's possible that both of these link into something that Dr. G referred to, that the building wasn't a temple, and as such, perhaps this was an annual rite to ensure that it was in a fit state for Vesta. According to Ovid, there was fun to be had elsewhere though. The fact that Vestals were continually making the mola salsa linked them to millers and bakers of Rome. These celebrated the festival by hanging wreaths on their millstones, and loaves of bread were hung on their donkeys. One final association of Vesta and the hearth links with a variation of Rome's foundation myth and the story of one of its kings. This comes from Plutarch, who mentions other accounts of the foundation myth. In his A Life of Romulus, he described a quite bizarre story which centred around a fiery ghost phallus which had emerged from the hearth. This took place in the home of Tarquetius, a king of the Albans, who was told by an oracle that a virgin needed to, shall we say, spend some time alone with the aforementioned apparition, as a child born from the union would be illustrious and surpass all others in strength and fortune. The king sent one of his daughters who, and who can blame her, wasn't keen, and instead sent one of her maids. When the king found out, he was furious, and he was about to have the maid killed when Hestia appeared to him and warned him not to. Instead, he waited until she had given birth to twins before ordering their deaths instead. The man charged with the act couldn't bring himself to do so, and instead left them by a river where a she-wolf found and suckled them. Yes, these were the twins, Romulus and Remus. A similar story is afforded to Servius Tullius, Rome's sixth king. The account comes from Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and I should note that even he thought it belonged to the realm of the fabulous. In this, we have a fiery phallus again appearing to a maid, who is told that it was a sign that she would conceive a famous son if she, well, you can work it out. The son born from the union was Servius Tullius, and in a separate myth, there's also a mention of flames. Here he is a slave whose destiny was only realised when flames were seen around his head as he slept in a doorway. So what we have are flames or fire from a hearth indicating greatness. From all of this, I hope you get the sense of how important the hearth was, both symbolically and in a practical sense, though perhaps less so as an absent father. What we know about the Vestalia suggests that it was a relatively solemn affair, albeit with the caveat that we don't have a lot of information. What we certainly don't have is plebs getting drunk en masse, people leaping over straw fires, or noisy processions with foreign priests dancing that I've featured in previous episodes. The millers and bakers seem to have had some fun, but we don't get that sense of a large festival, at best a few bemused donkeys. Even the Argae, with the caveat that this wasn't so much a festival as it was a procession, had a solemn hue about it. Consider the appearance of the Flaminica in a manner of dress which toned things down. That said, I like to think that even so, there would have been lots of excitement as people watched, and I am confident that the fate of those straw dolls thrown into the Tiber was something bet upon by a few onlookers. And on that upbeat note, I come to the end of the episode. I'm planning on another Night of the Living Dead episode in time for Halloween, and we'll be continuing with this mini-series, so I hope to get some more episodes for you as soon as I can. Until then, keep safe and stay well. A days.